Okay, welcome back. This is part two of running an offensive in Empire of the Sun, and we're going to take a look at a couple of other examples of fairly simple offensives, including an unopposed amphibious assault. There's actually no particular reason you couldn't watch this one first and watch part one second. They're just a variety of examples. But let's go ahead and dive into this next example here. This is actually the same game that we looked at in the prior example in part one. So this is the game where, if you haven't seen that, the Japanese got off to a very slow start with a lot of poor offensive cards. They had a bunch of reaction cards, including a lot of subs. They had some ISR cards to both put the Allies into and get themselves out of ISR. They also had a bunch of War in Europe cards. And so this is actually at the beginning of turn 3 before War in Europe has started to plummet. But actually by the end of turn 3, we're going to be down here in -7 territory. So things are going to get quite interesting in this game because it's a very slow start for the Japanese, but it's going to be a slow comeback for the Allies ultimately. So one of the things that's important to note is you'll see here with these flags, the Solomons, otherwise known as the Mandates, have already been taken by the Japanese. That happened on turn 2 when the Japanese took Rabaul and Guadalcanal. But the Japanese have not taken most of New Guinea. In fact, they basically took the western end of New Guinea, but didn't have enough activations as a result of fairly poor offensive cards to do much of anything in eastern New Guinea here. So we're looking at the Allies over here, their position at literally very early on. It's maybe the second card play, I think, for the Allies in turn 3, maybe even the first. And the Allies want to take advantage of the fact that the Japanese haven't had enough activations to get air into the Solomons. So if we look here at ZOIs, you'll see the Japanese have ZOIs up here, but they have nothing covering the Solomons. And that starts to get interesting because if you look here, the Allies don't have a lot of forces. They've got a CA and a Marine Air Wing there with basically a Marine brigade. Then they've got another slightly stronger Marine brigade here. They've got a battleship. They've got the 10th Air Force. And that's pretty much it. There's another Air Force over here. But in terms of naval and air units, there's an LRB back here, and there's another, the Australian Air Force is down there. But because it's turn 3, the Allies are pretty weak still in terms of, these are reinforcements, by the way, delayed reinforcements down here. The Allies are still pretty weak in terms of forces that they have on the map. They've got the 2 CVs up in Pearl Harbor, but they haven't managed to get them down to the Pacific yet. And so the Allied player is just looking at this and saying, you know, with no ZOIs over the Solomons, Bougainville is actually a very tempting target because you'll see if I get rid of the pieces here that Rabaul and Guadalcanal, which are the 2 hexes that control the Solomons, are both ports. And so Guadalcanal is nice to grab for a port, but if you can't grab Guadalcanal, Bougainville's a really good bet. And it's nice both as a port and also because getting an Allied air unit in there can then neutralize Japanese ZOIs over the Solomons, which allows an easier trace through here when trying to trace supplier activation from Central Pacific at Oahu. So the Allies have decided that their target for this operation is Bougainville. And it's actually going to be an operation in which they won't have to worry about a Japanese reaction because it's an undefended hex, which means they're not going to have to declare it as a battle hex. And because it's not in a Japanese zone of influence, the Japanese won't have a chance to roll for special reaction. We'll come back and look at what might happen there if, for example, this air unit were here and throwing a ZOI over Bougainville. That would change things a little bit. But for the moment, the actual play is this. There is no ZOI over Bougainville. So let's look at what we pull for a card and what we want to activate to run this offensive with. So the card that the Allies have chosen is Trade Wind Task Force. If you look at it here, it's a military event. And let me stop that so you can see it better. It's a military event. It's a 2OC for movement purposes, which means air units will be able to move 2 legs. Naval units will be able to move 10 hexes. The ground units here are not going to be moving by ground. They're just going to be the amphibious assault. Well, actually, I lied. There will be a ground movement. So the ground unit will have 2 movement points, and the amphibious assault will move as a naval unit. So it'll have 10 movement points. So that's what you use the OC for value here for when you're running a military event as the event. You can see that we can activate any HQ with this, and it's got a logistics value of 4 if we use the Southwest Pacific, or 3 for any other HQ that we might choose. And so what the Allies did was, looking down here, they selected the 8-8 Marine Brigade as the amphibious assaulting unit. They decided they wanted to move the Mississippi as well, and we'll talk about where the Mississippi goes in a second. There's a couple of other things that they really want to do. They would like to get an air unit into Bougainville to provide air cover, a ZOI over there for protection, as well as to allow supply trace through here. And if we come up to the top here, one of the things you'll notice is the U.S. is in inter-service rivalry. What that means is that the U.S. is not going to be able to activate both Army and Navy units, U.S. Army and Navy units at the same time, which means if we send in this naval unit, which is what we want to do because it's only 1 ASP, it's a Marine unit, but it counts as a naval unit because the Marines count as naval, not Army. And so by sending in that Marine, we're not going to be able to activate any Army air as the Allies. So what we can do is we could activate this Australian air, because ISR does not apply. If you're activating Australian units, you can then activate, or Commonwealth units in general, but in this area it's always, at least mostly, Australian units. You can, with the Australian units, you can activate either U.S. Army or U.S. Navy units, just not both. So in this case, because we're looking for air to go with our Marine unit, we're going to activate Australians to get the Australian air here. Since we're using Australians, that tells us that we need to use ANZAC for the activation, because ANZAC is able to, it's a joint HQ, so it's able to activate both Commonwealth units as well as U.S. units. MacArthur here at Southwest Pacific, being a U.S. HQ, cannot activate Commonwealth units. So we're going to rely on ANZAC here. So if we look over here, the logistics value, since we're not using Southwest Pacific, the logistics value is 3. We have 3 plus the 1 efficiency rating gives us 4 activations here. And so you can see I've got 2 activations over here, another activation here, and another activation here. So I've explained all the activations so far except the Port Moresby Brigade. The reason I'm activating the Port Moresby Brigade is that I would really like to push somebody over the mountains to Lae. Lae is a port, and I'd like to make it impossible for the Japanese to try to grab that. At this point, it's probably unlikely that they would, but it's nevertheless, at this point, the Allies want to start to push forward in New Guinea and take as many of these bases as they can. What will happen later is the Allies push up to Wewak, but the Japanese actually will take Hollandia. In any event, that's future. So let's just talk about this operation here. So what's going to happen is let's just double check supply. So at this point, there are no Japanese ZOIs in this area to block supply or activation trace. And so we only have to be concerned about the length of the line. ANZAC has got a radius of 10, and so you can see conveniently this column of hexes here is at the eastern edge of ANZAC's radius, and so these guys are in supply range and activation range, and we're okay. We've already talked about the fact that ANZAC is a legal and appropriate HQ here because it can activate both Commonwealth units, in this case Australian, and the U.S. naval units. We're not activating any U.S. Navy and Army at the same time here, which we can't because of ISR, so we're all good on the activations. So then we can start to move. So it's 2 movement points for mixed terrain, and that's exactly what it's going to take. We're moving 1 hex for 2 movement points there for the Port Moresby Brigade to move over to Ley. We are going to move this Marine unit, and he goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you recall, because this is a 2 OC, naval units, including amphibiously assaulting ground forces, can move up to 5 times 2, which is 10, and he moved 9 there, so that's legal. We don't have to worry about an escort here because there's no ZOI over the hex or any hexes he's moving through, and there's no Japanese naval unit in that hex that he has to worry about. So he doesn't need an escort. And so what's going to happen is the Mississippi could potentially move there with him, and if he needed an escort, it might make sense for the Mississippi. In fact, the Mississippi would need to be that escort, because if you're providing a naval escort, you have to move with the ground unit the entire way. But because we're not going to need an escort, the Mississippi actually, in this particular operation, went to Espiritu Santo. Whether that's a good move, whether it would have been better at Bougainville, ultimately you're going to see it doesn't matter, because the Mississippi is going to get sunk by submarines. So I'll have a little excitement here in a few minutes. But in any event, the play here was for the Mississippi to go to Espiritu Santo, largely to cover that port. That is the farthest port from Truk that's still in supply range for the Japanese. So if the Japanese were making some sort of play to try and cut the Allied supply line, that might be the place they would be trying to do it. Because the Japanese here are really behind the game on their expansion as a result of poor cards, that's extremely unlikely, but in any event, that's one reason that you might want to have a naval force or somebody in Espiritu Santo. So then the last play we had is this guy here. If you look at him, he's 4 extended range with parentheses. The parentheses only applies if he's going to be fighting in combat, and if that's the case, he can't move extended. He can only move his normal range. But because he's not fighting in combat, what he basically does is he's going to go 1 leg to Cape York. He'll go another leg over to Port Moresby, and then he'll actually have to stop there in movement because he's only got 2 legs at this point. And now all the movement for the Allied forces is done. And at this point, the Japanese would normally be rolling for intelligence condition and going ahead to react. But in fact, at this point, they can't react because there are no declared battle hexes and there are no opportunities for special reaction because I haven't taken any hexes that are in the ZOI of a Japanese unit. The only hex I've taken is Bougainville by Amphibious Assault, but because it's not in a Japanese ZOI, the Japanese don't have an opportunity to roll for special reaction there. So there will be no battle hexes in this particular offensive. That means there's not going to be any normal combat. But you're still following the standard defensive sequence of play here, and that does give the defender or the reaction player an opportunity to play any cards he might have. And as it happens, the Japanese player had a couple of sub-cards and decided to play both of his sub-cards. And each of the sub-cards got a hit, and so the Mississippi was sunk on its way from Numia to Espiritu Santo. Just by way of a quick note, the reaction player can play up to 3 reaction cards in any one offensive, and they can be reaction cards of any type. So that would include cards that set sort of a standard card that sets the intelligence condition to intercept. It could be the Japanese have a number of counterattack cards that both set the intelligence to intercept and also allow the Japanese to react with slightly larger forces than they might otherwise be able to. Sub-cards are reaction cards. Kamikaze cards are reaction cards. So the reaction player can play up to 3 reaction cards per offensive. and in this case, the Japanese player had 2 subcards that he played. As you'll see up here, because I'm in this vassal module in this particular game as the allies, not the Japanese, and not a referee, I can't show you the Japanese hand, but let me pull out a couple of allied subs just to talk about the subcards for a second. If you haven't looked closely at subcards, it's worth noting a few things. Let's take a look at this one. First of all, there's a little flavor on the top part of the card. Then the middle part of the card has a little table that shows you the die rolls that you need and how much damage you do depending on the die roll. So for this particular card, it says on a 0 to 7, this is an allied subcard, obviously, but so on a 0 to 7, the Japanese lose 1 step. On an 8 or a 9, there's no effect. Different subcards have different roll ranges. There actually is a card that can do 2 steps worth of damage. In general, it'll be no steps or 1 step. This card also has a little bit of an unusual element to it. This particular card, if you'll notice, it says the target naval unit must be inactive and in a non-Japanese island's port hex. Each side has a card that can actually target an inactive, or must target an inactive unit. But it's more common that you have the opportunity to attack a card that's participating in combat. It's been activated and participated in combat, or if there was no combat, at least it will be an active naval unit. One of the other things that you'll notice that can be different from card to card, if you look at the top of this card, it says play during an offensive before the beginning of the combat phase, or at the conclusion of the offensive if no battle hexes are declared. This one down here says, actually this is also play prior to combat, so I didn't get one of the ones that says play after combat. So some of the subcards are prior to, some of them are after. You can see this one, though, is a card that gives the opportunity to get either 1 or 2 hits. And then what these both have in common is they allow you to draw a strategy card, and they also must be removed from play if used as an event. So that's a quick look at subcards, but the main point is that the subcards vary a little bit, and so you have to read them carefully because they aren't all the same. So in any event, in this particular offensive, there was no normal combat. We did actually take a hex, though, without having to declare a battle hex because it was an unopposed amphibious assault. That cost us, by the way, 1 ASP, so we would have to, in fact, it looks like we already did move this up. We started with having spent none. We had 2 for the turn, and we spent 1 already to move this guy here. Actually, the last step after the sub-attack, since there was no combat, is the Allies get PBM, and in PBM, the Allies will move the Australian air here so that they now have a ZOI over the islands there to keep the Marines in supply and also allow a supply trace through the Solomons if necessary. So that's a quick look at an unopposed amphibious assault that also had some subcards played as part of the reaction. Let's take a look now at the same situation but with one slight change. Let's assume that this air flotilla up here is actually down in Rabaul. And if that's the case, you'll notice that there's now a ZOI over the Bougainville hex. And so it's still technically an unopposed landing because, and actually let's just clone the control marker because this is still controlled by the Japanese. So if we want to come and make this amphibious assault, the hex is undefended, but it's got a ZOI there. And so there's a couple of implications that make this a lot more complex than the first case that we just looked at there. So in this situation, first of all, this Marine brigade can't simply come marching into the hex like that. And the reason is that as soon as it goes from this hex into this hex, as soon as it enters the Bougainville hex from any of these other hexes over here, it's entering what is at the moment an unneutralized ZOI. And that is not legal for an amphibious assaulting ground force. So in order to be able to enter that hex, it's going to need some ZOI coverage. and there are a couple of ways to do that. One is to get an air unit over the hex. Unfortunately, that's not going to be possible right now because the closest, if we keep the ZOIs on here, the closest hex would be here or at Buna, and neither of those hexes make it. They're 3 hexes away, and so that doesn't cut it. So the only way we are going to be able to provide air coverage is going to be with a CV. And at the moment, we don't have a CV down here. So let's just cheat a little bit for the sake of making this a good example. And let's suppose that we actually did have the Lexington sitting down here in Espiritu Santo at the beginning of this operation. So how are we going to provide a ZOI coverage here? Well, this is where it starts to get even trickier because you need to understand the rules for naval movement. So a naval unit can end its move in a number of different places. It can end its move in a friendly port. That's not going to do us any good here, obviously, because we've already figured out that the nearest friendly ports are too far away to provide ZOI coverage, so we can't do it that way. You can also end your move in a hex that is able to support an amphibiously assaulting ground unit, but that amphibiously assaulting ground unit has to already be in the hex. So, for example, if the Marine Brigade were in Bougainville, Lexington could move to here and say, I'm supporting that hex right there. I'm good. I'm within a 2 hex range. Now, my problem is that doesn't solve our issue with the ZOI because the Marine Brigade has to be there first before the Lexington can move to that hex. So that approach doesn't work. We've got to be able to get the Lexington there before the Marine Brigade in order to provide the ZOI. So a couple of other options. A naval unit can move to a hex that contains an enemy unit. In other words, an enemy occupied hex of some sort. So we could move to Guadalcanal here if we wanted to, for example. We would be in the Guadalcanal hex there. And we would also have a ZOI over this hex. Or we can move someplace that we can attack an enemy unit. So Lexington could, if it wanted to, move to this hex and declare an attack against Guadalcanal, or it could move someplace like this hex or this hex, anything that's within range of Rabaul, and declare an attack against Rabaul. That causes us to then need, as long as we're starting to attack somebody else, that causes us to need to declare battle hexes for those hexes as well, which starts to get things more complicated. There is another approach. If the carrier started the operation in the same hex with the assaulting ground unit, and let's assume that we weren't taking the Mississippi, that instead we were taking the Lexington, then what could happen is these 2 units could actually move together. So essentially the CV is playing escort. It's playing both a naval escort and an air escort in this case. And so the CV and the Marine could move together into this hex. And in that particular situation, the CV doesn't need to be attacking anybody. It's simply escorting the unit into, in this case, an enemy ground hex. And so if you look at the rule, it's Rule 8.21 that describes very explicitly the different situations in which naval units are legally allowed to end their move. And it's really, really important that you be familiar with those, because you can get into trouble and do things that you're not supposed to do if you're not paying close attention to that particular section of the rules. So let's say for the moment that Lexington were actually based there at Noumea with this Marine Brigade. And by the way, it's a good reason to keep CVs with amphibiously assaulting forces, because it just makes things more convenient a lot of times if the CV can actually move with the assaulting ground unit and serve as both a naval and an air escort. So let's say we did that. And at this point, let's forget about the other units in this particular activation and just look for a second at this amphibious assault. So assuming we declared no battle hexes here, the Japanese still have an opportunity to try for a special reaction. And they can do that because, again, the target hex, which contains bases, is being amphibiously assaulted within the zone of influence of an air unit right here. And so what that means is before rolling for intelligence, and completely unrelated to rolling for intelligence, the Japanese are going to make a special reaction die roll. And they actually, what can make it a little bit confusing is that you use the intelligence die roll procedure and modifier if there is one, but the special reaction roll is a separate roll from the intel roll. So in this case, what we do is we look at the Trade Wind Task Force card. You see up there where it says OC2 EC4. We're using it as the event card, so we use the EC4 number. And that means we need a 4 or less on the die. But actually we need a 6 or less because we're entering a ZOI here. So we do get the Japanese get the -2 modifier. So that means the Japanese are going to be able to declare a special reaction on a 6 or less. So that's a 70% chance of being able to declare a special reaction hex. If they're able to declare a special reaction hex, they might then actually want to fight a battle there, and they would then roll for intelligence. And it's important to understand that the special reaction roll and the intelligence roll have no impact on each other whatsoever. You roll for special reaction first, but that roll has no effect on the intelligence roll at all. And so the Japanese would then be rolling, and it would be the exact same roll that they'd need 4 or less, but with a -2 die roll modifier, they'd need a 6 or less on the die. And so they would then also have a 70% chance of getting an intercept condition for intelligence. So if you look at the odds there, a 70% chance to declare special reaction and a 70% chance to get intercept, the Japanese have a 49% chance of successfully being able to intercept and fight a combat in that battle. So all of a sudden, from the situation here where there was no ZOI, we didn't need any supporting naval units at all, we could just grab that hex for free, just by virtue of the Japanese having a ZOI over that hex. They now have, with this particular card, a 50% chance of being able to react against this force. And as the Allies, when we're planning our operation, we have to recognize that a 50% chance of intercept is pretty high, and we had better be prepared for that. And since this is a 2 OC card, and let's assume for a minute that they don't have any counteroffensive, that they're just doing a normal reaction, they'd get 2 activations for the card, 2 activations for South Seas, which is the HQ that's in range. So they could bring 4 units to an intercept battle, and so 4 units could easily handle the Lexington here. So we would need to think very seriously about beefing that up and looking at what we have in the area. You know, we've got the Mississippi and we've got the CA here. That's not a whole lot of firepower. And so there's a pretty good chance that if the Japanese were able to intercept, they might do enough damage that they could send the amphibious assault force packing. And so as the Allies in that situation, you'd want to think pretty carefully about what the reaction possibilities were and whether you actually want to make that attack or not. It gets even more dangerous, obviously, if, let's say we were to, let's send these guys back here for a second, and let's look at the third scenario where, let's say that the air unit is actually in the Bougainville hex at this point. Now, because there's a unit in the hex, we have the same situation. The carrier will play escort to the Marines. They'll end up in the hex. But at this point now, That's going to be a battle hex. We've moved into an enemy occupied hex. We're conducting an amphibious assault. We have to declare that as a battle hex. And so there's no need to roll for special reaction. It is a battle hex. The Japanese will still have to roll, and it'll be a 6 or less, 4 with the -2 modifier. So they'll have a 70% chance to get intercept and be able to react. And so at this point, they now have a 70% chance of bringing a force to fight. And so that's a very significant probability that we're going to get our butts kicked there if we're not careful. So this is why it's really important as the allies to, when you're, for the Japanese are conducting most of their amphibious assaults early in the game when there's almost nothing that the allies can do about it. So the Japanese just have to go hell-bent for leather as fast as they can. The allies, when they turn around and start having to make amphibious assaults, it gets a lot more complicated for them because they have to think very carefully about what they can safely take and what they can't. And they have to factor in whether they can grab something for free, whether there's the chance of a special reaction die roll, or whether the Japanese are going to be able to react simply because it's battle hex and there's a high probability of making the intel roll. We're at 30 minutes here, so I think we need to wrap this up, but we'll come back and take a look in a future video at a more complex offensive involving multiple amphibious assaults and the possibility of actually reaction amphibious assault as well. And coming up, we'll also look at hit allocation, particularly in air-naval combat, because that can make things fairly interesting. And is something that you definitely need to sort of understand and master in order to be able to fight your offensives effectively.